What if one moment could shatter everything you thought you knew about a person? 1 second, a blur of metal and glass, and suddenly, a life defined by power, fame, and unshakable confidence is left exposed, raw, vulnerable, and questioning everything. That moment came today, not on a boxing ring, not under the bright lights of Wembley or Madison Square Garden, but on a lonely stretch of the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway in Magung, Nigeria. And at the center of it all, sitting in the wreckage of a crashed SUV, was none other than Anthony Joshua, former heavyweight world champion, UK hero, and an icon whose name echoes through arenas and screens around the world. The images are haunting. Footage posted online shows him shirtless, dazed, amidst shards of glass, his massive frame slumped against the seat. He is no longer the invincible fighter who once towered over every opponent. Instead, he is human, vulnerable, and, as the world would soon learn, on the verge of making a shocking announcement that would stun millions. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But before we get there, we have to understand the story behind the moment. The collision that left 2 lives tragically cut short, the chaos that unfolded on that sun-drenched Nigerian highway, and the shocking circumstances that led to a high-speed disaster no one saw coming. Because this isn't just a story about a car crash. This is a story about fame, mortality, the fragility of life, and the crushing weight of choices made in a split second. It was shortly after 11 a.m. when the SUV carrying Anthony Joshua collided with a stationary truck. Witnesses say the vehicle was traveling beyond the legally prescribed speed limit, attempting an overtaking maneuver that ended in catastrophe. Joshua, seated behind the driver alongside another passenger, had no time to react. His security detail, following closely behind, watched in horror as the vehicle smashed into the truck, metal twisting, glass exploding. 5 men were involved in the crash, and the consequences were immediate and devastating. 2 people would not survive. Joshua, miraculously, sustained only minor injuries, but the psychological scars, the emotional weight, were just beginning. And that is the twist that makes this story so compelling. Because even though Anthony walked away, the world he returned to was no longer the same. Fans across the UK, friends, family, and even the boxing world itself were about to be confronted with something far more shocking than the crash. A decision that would shake the foundations of his career, tarnish the certainty of his legacy, and leave everyone asking the same impossible question: why? Imagine, for a moment, the adrenaline pumping through Joshua's veins as the SUV spiraled out of control. Imagine the deafening screech of tires against asphalt, the metallic crunch of impact, the shattering sound of glass exploding across the interior. And then, silence. Chaos around him, strangers screaming, security personnel shouting instructions, emergency services racing against the clock. And in the midst of it all, a man who had faced the world's most fearsome fighters, taken blow after blow, was suddenly confronted with the fragility of his own existence. The world knows Anthony Joshua as a powerhouse, a man whose name alone carries weight, whose fists have knocked out legends, and whose discipline in the gym is almost mythical. But what happens when that discipline, that invincibility, meets an unforeseen disaster? How does someone who has spent decades perfecting control confront chaos that cannot be fought with strength alone? And most importantly, what happens when that same man decides, in the aftermath of tragedy, that it is time to step away? Public reaction was instantaneous. Social media erupted. Fans flooded timelines with messages ranging from shock to concern to disbelief. Headlines screamed variations of the same phrase: Anthony Joshua injured in fatal crash. 2 dead, Joshua survives. UK boxer shocked by tragedy in Nigeria. The world paused, collectively holding its breath. And then came the whispers, rumors, speculation, and eventually, the revelation that would leave everyone speechless. Anthony Joshua was resigning. Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. A man who has dominated the heavyweight division, whose very presence has been synonymous with strength and endurance, was now announcing a decision that no one could have predicted. Why? Because this wasn't a career-ending injury. This wasn't a scandal born from behavior or failed promotion. This was the aftermath of a life-altering event, a collision that changed everything. And yet, even as news outlets scrambled to report on his physical state, the emotional dimensions of the story remained largely hidden. What did Joshua see in those moments after the crash? The fear, the anger, the guilt? How did it feel to witness the loss of life while knowing he had survived? And in the quiet moments of recovery, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital room far from the roaring crowds and cheering fans, what thoughts ran through his mind that led him to the announcement that would shock an entire nation? The footage online gives only a glimpse. There he sits, shirtless, his expression dazed, hands trembling slightly as he leans back in the seat. There is glass everywhere. The SUV, once a symbol of safety and security, is now a mangled cage. The chaos of the crash site is captured in snapshots. People rushing to help, the distant wail of sirens, Joshua's security team coordinating, attempting to restore order. But none of these images can fully capture the inner turmoil, the existential confrontation with mortality, the immediate recognition of fragility, and the overwhelming emotional weight that follows surviving when others do not. And what of his family? His father, Robert Joshua. His mother, Yetta Odesanya. His brother, Jacob Joshua. They must have felt the collision's reverberations as a seismic shock, not just across distance, but across their lives, their sense of normalcy, their understanding of who Anthony Joshua truly is. The public rarely sees this side of a celebrity, the intimate human moments of fear, concern, and helplessness. Yet here they are, witnessing a son, a brother, a loved one in a state of vulnerability that words alone cannot convey. The stakes are not only personal. They are national. The UK, a country that has celebrated Joshua's triumphs and mourned his losses, was now bracing for an announcement that could redefine everything. Because Anthony Joshua's decision to step back from the sport is not merely a career move. It is a seismic event, a revelation that challenges everything fans thought they knew about resilience, ambition, and the costs of life in the limelight. But even in this storm of tragedy and public attention, a question lingers. What drove him to say those words? What thoughts, what fears, what realizations compelled a man who had faced the world's fiercest opponents to walk away from the stage that defined him? And perhaps most importantly, how would the UK, his fans, and the boxing world respond when the full truth came to light? Because this is not just the story of a car crash. It is a story of survival, guilt, fame, and the crushing pressure of decisions made in seconds that echo for a lifetime. It is a story about a man confronting the limits of control, realizing that some battles cannot be won in the ring. And as we will explore over the next hour, this story is filled with revelations, emotional twists, and shocking confessions that no one could have predicted. And yet, we are only scratching the surface. Because what Anthony Joshua revealed next, what he whispered to his family, to officials, to those closest to him, was something that would shock the entire UK. It wasn't just the crash that made headlines. It was the decision that followed. The resignation that sent shockwaves through arenas, gyms, and living rooms from London to Lagos. What if everything you thought you knew about speed, control, and fate vanished in an instant? That is exactly what happened on that fateful morning on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. At roughly 11:15 a.m., the sun beating down on the asphalt, traffic moving in rhythmic waves, Anthony Joshua's SUV approached a stationary truck parked on the roadside. In an instant, a split-second decision, an overtaking maneuver, would set off a chain reaction that nobody could have predicted. Eyewitnesses describe it as a scene from a nightmare. Tires screeching, metal grinding against metal, glass erupting like crystal fireworks across the highway. Some say the SUV appeared to bounce against the truck, its momentum throwing passengers forward, the sound deafening, the air thick with dust and smoke. For Anthony Joshua, sitting behind the driver, there was no time to process, no time to react, no chance to control what was happening. And yet, he survived. Others weren't so lucky. 5 men were caught in the maelstrom. 2 would not survive. The survivors, including Joshua, were rushed to safety, each grappling with shock, confusion, and the terrifying realization of mortality. But what caused the crash? Authorities stated that the SUV was traveling beyond the legally prescribed speed limit, attempting an overtaking maneuver that went catastrophically wrong. On paper, it sounds simple, but in reality, the chaos is indescribable. Imagine the perspective of someone behind the wheel of that stationary truck. One moment, a quiet morning on the expressway. The next, a monstrous SUV hurtling towards you at impossible speed. The impact must have felt like an explosion. The metallic screech, the sudden jerk, the shattering of glass. This is a collision that leaves no part of you untouched. And for Joshua, trained to endure physical punishment, there was no punch, no opponent, no arena. Just the cold reality of uncontrollable disaster. Security personnel trailing behind the SUV were paralyzed by the moment. Their instincts screamed for immediate action. But how do you save someone in a moving cage of steel, already colliding with fate? In minutes, the road was filled with bystanders, emergency personnel, and the panicked cries of those witnessing the aftermath. One can only imagine the tension, the surge of adrenaline, and the helplessness of the moment. Joshua's injuries were classified as minor. A miracle, some would say, considering the sheer violence of the collision. But minor is relative. In truth, the injuries were physical, yes, but the emotional and psychological impact of surviving when others did not would leave deep, lasting scars. And this is the story that the public rarely sees. The trauma behind the headlines, the guilt, and the reckoning that comes with living when others die. The SUV itself, a Lexus model chosen for its reputation for safety, was reduced to a twisted shell. The doors were mangled, the windows shattered, the front crumpled against the truck's unforgiving metal frame. Officials took note of the damage and began their investigation immediately. Every scrape, dent, and broken glass shard told a story of speed, misjudgment, and perhaps even fate. But there was another layer to this crash that would only emerge later. Anthony Joshua, despite being behind the wheel's passenger seat, had been shielded to an extent by the vehicle's structure. The driver and other passenger bore their own injuries, each a testament to the violent physics of the moment. It's often said that in accidents like this, luck is as critical as skill. And for Joshua, luck had chosen him, but it had not been so kind to others. As news of the crash spread, the imagery of the scene became seared into public consciousness. Videos posted online showed Joshua sitting shirtless, dazed, amidst shattered glass, his massive frame almost cartoonishly vulnerable. The juxtaposition was stark. A man celebrated for his physical prowess reduced to a figure of shock, human fragility on full display. Every eye that saw those images felt it, the tension, the disbelief, the primal recognition of how quickly life can be stripped away. And yet, the story was far from over. Because surviving is only part of the narrative. The real story, the part that would shock the UK and the world, is what happened next. How Anthony Joshua processed the crash, how he confronted the loss of life, and how, in the days that followed, he would arrive at a decision that stunned everyone. The announcement that he was resigning from the sport that had defined him. But before we get there, we need to understand the human cost of the crash itself. The two men who perished in the accident were not just statistics. They were fathers, sons, neighbors, friends. Their lives, ended in an instant, sent ripples through their communities and through the hearts of those who witnessed the aftermath. The contrast is almost unbearable. Joshua, alive and recovering, and yet haunted by the knowledge that others were not so fortunate. How does a person reconcile that? How does someone accustomed to triumph, discipline, and control process a moment in which they had no power at all? It is here, in this collision of fate and circumstance, that the story shifts from a simple accident to a narrative of human fragility, resilience, and ultimately, the kind of decision-making that is impossible to predict. Joshua's immediate response, captured in shaky mobile footage, shows the blend of shock, awareness, and composure that only someone trained to perform under extreme pressure could maintain. He speaks briefly to officials, answers questions, and yet, behind those actions, there is a storm of thought, fear, guilt, and perhaps the realization that life, even for someone as strong as him, is fragile and fleeting. This is the crux of the matter. Because surviving the crash is one thing. Processing it, confronting what it means, and then deciding to take action, resignation, stepping away from the sport, and facing the public's reaction, is an entirely different challenge. And it is precisely this journey, from metal and glass to resignation, that would grip the UK in shock. Authorities later confirmed that the crash's circumstances were rooted in excessive speed and an overtaking maneuver gone wrong. But for Joshua, the technical details mattered less than the visceral reality of the moment. What did it feel like to experience impact that could have ended everything? How do you weigh survival against the knowledge of loss? And more importantly, how do you communicate that experience to the world in a way that conveys both reality and responsibility? Even as emergency personnel worked to extract Joshua and the other survivors, the public was already forming narratives. Social media erupted, debates raged, and speculation ran rampant. But behind the headlines, behind the Twitter posts and online videos, there was a deeply human story unfolding. One that involved courage, fear, and the heavy weight of survival. Because for Anthony Joshua, this crash was more than an accident. It was a reckoning. It was a mirror held up to a life defined by strength and dominance, forcing him to confront vulnerability in its rawest form. And as he left the wreckage, bruised but alive, he began a process that would lead to the most shocking announcement of his career. A crash that could have ended everything instead became the starting point of a story no one anticipated. And as the UK waited with bated breath for news, the world was about to witness not just a sporting update, but a personal revelation that would change the way everyone saw Anthony Joshua forever. 2 lives ended in a heartbeat. That is the harsh reality of the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway crash, a reality that no headline, no video clip, and no viral social media post can truly capture. In the immediate aftermath, Anthony Joshua walked away physically unharmed. Yet the people who occupied that same stretch of asphalt were not so lucky. They became names in police reports, faces in CCTV footage, and, tragically, numbers in the growing tally of road fatalities in Nigeria. But these were real people, with families, futures, and stories abruptly halted in the blink of an eye. It is almost impossible to comprehend the human cost. One man, a father in his early 40s, left behind a young child who would never understand why their parent did not come home. Another, barely in his 30s, had ambitions, a career, and loved ones who will forever grapple with the question, why him and not us? The stark contrast between survival and death can be cruelly arbitrary, and yet it is the kind of question that haunts those involved, especially when a world-famous figure like Joshua is among the survivors. Witnesses at the scene describe chaos, the frantic cries of bystanders, the smoke curling from the vehicles, the urgent arrival of emergency services. But the fatalities were immediate. The first man, trapped in the twisted metal of the truck's rear section, succumbed to his injuries before paramedics could reach him. The second, a passenger in the SUV, was pinned under debris, his life extinguished in seconds. The descriptions are stark, almost cinematic, but they are rooted in a painful, unavoidable truth. Sometimes survival is random, and sometimes tragedy is unavoidable. For Joshua, witnessing, or even hearing of, the fatalities must have been a piercing moment of clarity. In the middle of a disaster that could have been his undoing, he was spared. Others were not. Survivors often report feelings of guilt, of responsibility, even when none exists. The psychological weight of living while others die is enormous, and it is a weight that Joshua, despite years of mental and physical discipline, would have felt immediately. Family members of the deceased arrived at the scene shortly after the emergency response, faces etched with disbelief, hands trembling, eyes wide with horror. They were not just observing an accident, they were confronting the loss of someone irreplaceable. And for the public, for fans watching online, it was impossible to fully grasp this emotional intensity. Headlines could not communicate the grief, the fear, the anger, but it was there, palpable, a human element that would echo in the story long after the metal had been cleared from the road. Emergency responders worked frantically, pulling survivors from mangled seats, covering bodies, and securing the area. Police officers began documenting the scene, noting the SUV's trajectory, the angle of the impact, and the physical evidence that would later help reconstruct the accident. But in all of this, there was an invisible aftermath. The emotional wreckage, the mental trauma that lingers long after bruises heal. For Anthony Joshua, surviving such a collision is a dual-edged sword. On one side, there is relief, gratitude, and the recognition that life continues. On the other, there is an inescapable confrontation with mortality, with the fact that two men did not survive, and perhaps, in some subconscious way, he might wonder if it should have been him. Survivor's guilt is a phenomenon rarely discussed in the context of celebrity, but it exists profoundly, and it touches everyone who escapes when others perish. The Nigerian road safety authorities confirmed the fatalities officially later that day. Both victims were identified, their families notified, and investigations into the crash were underway. The public response was immediate: shock, sorrow, and a flood of condolences. Social media platforms, which often thrive on viral celebrity content, suddenly became spaces of mourning. Hashtags honoring the deceased circulated. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of fatalities and incidents like this is the unpredictability. The SUV could have missed the stationary truck. The overtaking maneuver might have been executed perfectly. Timing, distance, and physics combined with human error created an irreversible outcome. And in that cruel twist, life and death were assigned without reason, leaving survivors to grapple with questions that have no answers. In this moment, we are forced to confront the fragility of human life. The two men who died will never see another sunrise, never speak to their loved ones again, never resume the ordinary rhythms of their lives. And yet, their story is inseparable from Joshua's survival. Every headline, every news clip, every social media post carries the shadow of these fatalities. Their absence amplifies the emotional gravity of Joshua's decisions, including the shocking resignation that would follow in the coming days. Consider this: the same crash that spared a world champion boxer took the lives of two men, unknown to the world yet deeply significant to those who love them. The randomness is staggering. It forces us to question notions of control, luck, and destiny. Joshua's skill and strength could not prevent the deaths of others. Training and discipline could not alter the outcome. It is here, amid tragedy, that the human story becomes starkest, where heroism and heartbreak collide. The road itself, a seemingly ordinary stretch of asphalt connecting Lagos and Ibadan, became a stage for human drama. In minutes, a location that had seen thousands of vehicles pass safely now bore witness to devastation, grief, and the surreal presence of a global sports icon confronted with mortality. For the authorities, the crash demanded precision and procedure. For survivors, it demanded reflection, acceptance, and perhaps eventual healing. And for Joshua, it demanded a reckoning that no amount of physical conditioning could prepare him for. Witnesses reported a mixture of responses from Joshua and his fellow passengers immediately following the crash. Some were crying, some were silent, some were too stunned to move. In moments like these, instinct often overrides thought, and yet, Joshua, even in shock, maintained a level of composure that only someone trained to perform under extreme pressure could achieve. He spoke briefly with officials, answered questions, and began the process of understanding the magnitude of what had just occurred. And still, in the shadow of the fatalities, the first whispers of a larger story began to emerge. Because surviving a crash is not just about escaping physical harm. It is about surviving emotionally, psychologically, and socially. And for a man of Joshua's stature, the collision's impact would ripple far beyond his immediate survival. His next steps, his reflections, and ultimately, his shocking resignation would all be colored by the deaths that occurred on that same highway. 2 lives lost, 1 survivor, haunted and shaken, and the world, watching in disbelief. The question is not just who survived, but how do you continue when others did not? And what Joshua would decide in the wake of tragedy. The announcement that would rock the UK and leave fans worldwide questioning everything was still just over the horizon. What goes through the mind of a man who has faced the most fearsome opponents in the world, only to be confronted by an enemy he cannot punch, grapple with, or control? Anthony Joshua, a man who built his life around discipline, strength, and precision, suddenly found himself in a situation where none of those qualities could save him or those around him. The Lagos-Ibadan Expressway crash was not just a test of survival. It was a confrontation with mortality, with guilt, and with the fragility of a life that had always seemed untouchable. Picture it, Joshua, sitting shirtless in the wrecked SUV, the chaos of the crash surrounding him. Dust in the air, shattered glass cutting tiny lines into his skin, adrenaline coursing through every muscle. His training had taught him to react quickly, to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. There was no opponent to anticipate, no strategy to implement, only the stark, unyielding reality of impact, injury, and death. And as his heart pounded and his breaths came fast, a terrifying thought struck. This is what it feels like to be completely powerless. Joshua's perspective at that moment was a complex, almost paradoxical mix of emotions. Relief, fear, guilt, confusion, anger. He had survived, but at what cost? The thought of the two men who had died, whose lives were taken in the blink of an eye, weighed heavily on him. Could he have done something differently? Should he have braked sooner? Should he have been more vigilant, more cautious? In seconds, a lifetime of training met the brutal unpredictability of reality, and Joshua was forced to confront the limits of control. In interviews later with close friends and members of his security team, they described him as stunned but incredibly composed, a juxtaposition that speaks to the dichotomy of the situation. Externally, Joshua maintained the calm presence expected of a world champion. Internally, however, a storm of emotions raged. There is a psychological phenomenon known as survivor's guilt, a state of consciousness where surviving an incident when others do not can provoke intense feelings of responsibility, shame, or anguish. For Joshua, this was not hypothetical. It was immediate and inescapable. Even trained athletes, accustomed to pain and adversity, have vulnerabilities when faced with uncontrollable events. The crash shattered not just the vehicle, but also the illusion of invincibility. Joshua, who had repeatedly demonstrated dominance in the ring, now faced a far more personal opponent, the uncertainty of life itself. He had confronted blows, knockdowns, and grueling matches, yet none of these prepared him for the collision of steel and fate that left him alive while others did not. His first thoughts were reportedly practical, ensuring that his fellow passengers were alive, confirming the safety of his security team, and checking his own injuries. But as minutes passed, more introspective thoughts began to surface. What would this mean for his career? For his family? For the fans who had cheered for him, sometimes blindly, for years? In those silent moments amidst the wreckage, Joshua was no longer just a boxer. He was a man confronting fragility, guilt, and an existential reckoning that had no clear solution. There is something uniquely isolating about being famous in moments like this. Ordinary people experience accidents, tragedies, and survival, but a celebrity's every movement is scrutinized, every expression analyzed. For Joshua, this meant that even as he processed his own fear and trauma, he was aware, perhaps subconsciously, that the world was watching. Every word he spoke, every reaction he displayed would be dissected and shared, forming narratives that he could not fully control. It added a layer of complexity to an already overwhelming experience. Reports indicate that while sitting in the wrecked SUV, Joshua's mind replayed the moments before impact in a continuous loop, a psychological phenomenon common in trauma survivors. The overtaking maneuver, the speed, the truck parked on the roadside, it all became part of an internal dialogue, an endless what-if scenario. Could he have done something differently? Could a different decision have saved the lives of the two men who died? Questions like these can torment even the most disciplined minds, and for Joshua, they were likely inescapable. Then there is the physical aspect. Though Joshua sustained only minor injuries, the sensation of impact, the tremor of muscles, and the shock of the body reacting to sudden trauma cannot be underestimated. He had trained to withstand punches, to absorb force and remain upright in the ring. But the force of a high-speed SUV collision is not something training prepares you for. It is random, uncontrolled, and utterly humbling. It reminded Joshua, in a visceral way, that even the strongest are not immune to the whims of chance. Beyond physicality and guilt, Joshua's perspective included acute awareness of public perception. He knew that news of the crash would spread rapidly. Fans would worry, media outlets would speculate, and social media would explode. Even while grappling with immediate trauma, he was already considering the narrative that would reach millions. For someone who has spent years cultivating a public persona of strength, composure, and dominance, this added pressure was immense. It was not just survival. It was survival under the gaze of the world. In the hours that followed, while being transported to the hospital, Joshua reportedly began reflecting more deeply. What did survival mean in this context? How does one reconcile being alive when others are not? How does one continue a career, a public life, when the emotional weight of such an incident is so profound? These questions, haunting and relentless, began to shape the decisions he would make in the days that followed. And yet, even amidst fear and uncertainty, there were moments of clarity. Joshua, known for his mental toughness, understood that panic would accomplish nothing. The crash had occurred. Lives had been lost. He was alive. The logical part of his mind began working through next steps: medical evaluation, family notification, and eventually, a plan for addressing the public. But beneath that logic was the more complex, emotional realization that his life had shifted irrevocably. Joshua's perspective was also informed by the contrast between control in the ring and control in life. In boxing, every punch, every movement, every strategy is calculated. There are rules, boundaries, and patterns. On that highway, there were no rules. There were no boundaries he could influence. No amount of training or skill could change the trajectory of the SUV once it began its fatal course. It was a stark, almost cruel lesson. Sometimes, strength and skill are irrelevant. Life can pivot on a single moment, and the consequences are often irreversible. Even now, in hindsight, Joshua's perspective during the crash illuminates the complex intersection of fate, skill, and human vulnerability. It forces us to question assumptions about control, power, and resilience. For a man celebrated for his dominance, the crash was a humbling reminder that life's most profound challenges are not always fought in a ring. They are confronted in moments of sheer unpredictability. And this perspective, raw and unfiltered, is what would later drive the decision that shocked the UK. Because surviving was only the first challenge. The real test. Confronting loss, guilt, public expectation, and the weight of mortality was only just beginning. Joshua's mind, in those first hours after the crash, was a battlefield, not of punches and counterpunches, but of emotion, reflection, and existential reckoning. He had survived a moment that could have killed him. He had witnessed death and destruction. And now, he had to navigate a world that would never see him the same way again. The moment the news broke, the United Kingdom stopped. Phones lit up, social media feeds exploded, and newsrooms scrambled to verify details. Anthony Joshua, the nation's beloved heavyweight champion, was involved in a high-speed crash in Nigeria. 2 people had died. Joshua had survived, and the world was watching, captivated, horrified, and desperate for answers. Imagine the tension in living rooms across London, Manchester, and Birmingham. Fans who had followed every jab, uppercut, and knockout were suddenly glued to news updates, their admiration for Joshua mixed with fear and disbelief. How could a man who seemed larger than life, who had survived every fight, now be vulnerable in a moment of pure chance? The juxtaposition was staggering. Invincible in the ring, human on a Nigerian highway. Social media erupted almost immediately. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook feeds filled with shock, sympathy, and speculation. Hashtags like #AnthonyJoshuaCrash and #PrayForAJ trended within minutes. Some users shared eyewitness videos of the mangled SUV and Joshua sitting dazed among the shattered glass. Others posted photos of Joshua's career highlights, framing the contrast between triumph and tragedy. The mix of admiration and concern created a unique emotional tension, a nation simultaneously mourning and grateful. Celebrities, journalists, and athletes weighed in. Fellow boxers expressed disbelief. "I can't believe it," wrote one on Instagram. "Stay strong, brother," wrote another. Public figures added their voices, sending messages of support and urging calm while authorities investigated. But mixed in with the sympathy were questions. How did this happen? Could it have been prevented? What would this mean for Joshua's career? The nation's obsession with him turned from celebration to anxious concern in a matter of hours. News outlets began dissecting every aspect of the crash. National newspapers ran front-page stories, emphasizing the fatalities and Joshua's survival. Broadcast networks interrupted schedules to provide live updates, interviews with officials, and statements from the Nigerian road safety authorities. The public demanded answers, but the full story was only beginning to emerge. In this wave of coverage, emotional contrasts were everywhere. Clips of Joshua in the ring, punching with unrelenting force, standing victorious, were juxtaposed with footage of him sitting shirtless in the wrecked SUV. The contrast was jarring. One moment, a figure of invincibility. The next, a man exposed to raw vulnerability. It was a visual representation of fragility meeting fame, and it gripped the public imagination like nothing else could. Fans flooded the comment sections, sharing personal reflections, prayers, and disbelief. "I can't believe this is happening," wrote one. "He's our hero. How did this happen?" wrote another. Even people who were not die-hard boxing fans were drawn in, captivated by the narrative of survival, tragedy, and the impending revelation that would soon shake the UK. The media also amplified speculation. Headlines questioned not just the crash, but its implications. Will Joshua fight again? Two dead in tragic crash. UK boxer faces life-altering decisions. Every update was a cliffhanger, every detail carefully dissected for public consumption. And yet, amid all the coverage, the human story, the raw emotion, the guilt, the psychological toll on Joshua, remained largely unseen. At the same time, the public reaction revealed contradictions in society's response to celebrity. Many expressed overwhelming sympathy for Joshua, while simultaneously scrutinizing his actions and the circumstances of the crash. Questions arose about speed, decision-making, and responsibility. Was this just an accident, or was negligence involved? The debate raged online, adding layers of tension and curiosity that made the story impossible to look away from. Even within Joshua's fanbase, emotions ran high. Younger fans who admired his strength and charisma felt shock and confusion. Older fans reflected on his career trajectory and feared that this incident might mark the end of an era. Across the UK, conversations buzzed in homes, workplaces, and sports clubs. Did he survive? How badly was he hurt? What will this mean for boxing? Each question fed into a growing suspense, an emotional hook that pulled people deeper into the unfolding drama. Meanwhile, social media also began sharing clips of Joshua's family reactions. His father, mother, and brother were shown in tense, private moments, revealing the emotional depth of the situation. The public, always curious about the personal lives of celebrities, was granted a glimpse into fear, anxiety, and heartbreak. It added another layer of complexity. While the UK processed the national shock, Joshua's family confronted it in real time, silently, privately, and with profound intensity. As the hours passed, the UK's fascination shifted from the crash itself to Joshua's state of mind. Would he fight again? Would he make a public statement? Or would he, in a surprising twist, do something the nation could not anticipate? These questions created a suspense that fueled media coverage and social discussion. Every tweet, post, and article teased the answer but did not provide it, keeping the audience hooked, hearts racing, and minds speculating. This collective tension, shared by millions across the country, illustrates the emotional power of celebrity. Joshua was more than a boxer. He was a symbol, a national figure whose personal crisis became a shared experience for a population. The crash was no longer just a Nigerian highway incident. It was a story that connected with the hopes, fears, and imaginations of an entire nation. And yet, amid the public frenzy, the most important truth remained. Joshua himself was processing a profound personal reckoning. While the UK speculated, debated, and prayed, he confronted mortality, guilt, and the emotional weight of survival. The nation's reactions, supportive, anxious, critical, would ultimately intersect with his own decisions in ways that nobody could foresee. As night fell over London, Manchester, and Birmingham, social media feeds were still ablaze. News coverage shifted from the crash to Joshua's possible next steps. Analysts speculated on his health, his career, and the timing of any statement. Fans argued over whether this would be the end of his boxing journey. Everyone was waiting, collectively holding their breath. Because what the UK did not yet know, and what Joshua had yet to reveal, was a personal decision that would stun the public, overshadow the crash, and redefine the narrative entirely. It wasn't the collision itself that would dominate headlines for the next week. It was the choice Anthony Joshua would make in response. And that choice, unknown to everyone at the time, would send shockwaves across sports, media, and every living room in the country. Imagine receiving a phone call or a message that changes your life in an instant. For Anthony Joshua's family, that call came in the form of news about the crash on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. A moment that started like any other morning suddenly became a day of fear, uncertainty, and heartbreak. His father, Robert Joshua, his mother, Yetta Odesanya, and his brother, Jacob Joshua, all confronted the unimaginable. Their son, their brother, a man celebrated around the world, was in a life-threatening situation hundreds of miles away. The family's first reaction was pure panic. The mind races in such moments. How bad are his injuries? Is he conscious? Are the other passengers okay? They had watched countless fights, known him as a fighter, a survivor, but this was different. This was not a contest of skill or endurance. This was raw, unfiltered danger, and they could do nothing to intervene. Robert Joshua, his father, has always been a figure of quiet strength and guidance. In interviews following the crash, friends described him as protective, deeply concerned, and immediately mobilized to understand the situation. He spoke to authorities, coordinated with security teams, and tried to keep calm for the family, though inside he was consumed with worry. The thought of his son sitting in a mangled SUV, possibly injured, possibly worse, must have been unbearable. Yetta Odesanya, Joshua's mother, reportedly collapsed when she first heard the news. The raw fear of losing a child, intensified by the public nature of Joshua's life, was overwhelming. Her thoughts immediately went to the fatalities, to the risk to her son, and to the ripple effects this would have on his career and mental health. Mothers instinctively carry the emotional weight of their children, and in this moment, Yetta's entire being was consumed by a mix of terror, disbelief, and helplessness. Jacob Joshua, Anthony's younger brother, faced the situation with a different lens. Younger siblings often feel powerless in family crises. Jacob reportedly stayed close to his parents, trying to support them, while simultaneously grappling with his own shock and fear. The knowledge that Anthony had survived, but others had not, likely created an emotional tension that weighed heavily on him. Survivor's guilt is not confined to those in the crash. It can extend to family members who witnessed the aftermath and struggle to process emotions on behalf of their loved ones. The family's response was not only emotional, but also practical. They coordinated with Nigerian authorities, communicated with the boxer's security detail, and tried to gather accurate information amidst a flood of conflicting reports. Rumors spread online, social media speculation ran rampant, and news outlets reported partial or unverified details. The family had to navigate a web of uncertainty while managing their own emotional response, a task that is almost impossible under ordinary circumstances, let alone when the world is watching. Footage posted online showing Joshua in the aftermath, shirtless and dazed among shattered glass, amplified the family's distress. Public curiosity is often cruel. The visuals of a loved one in shock, exposed, and vulnerable can intensify personal anguish. For Robert, Yetta, and Jacob, seeing Anthony in that state may have been simultaneously relieving and horrifying. Relieving because he survived, horrifying because it made the reality of the crash undeniable. There is also the emotional complexity of public perception. Families of celebrities must balance their personal grief and fear with the awareness that millions of eyes are on them. Every gesture, expression, and statement is scrutinized. The Joshua family was forced to grapple not only with their private concerns, but also with the public's expectation that they remain composed, dignified, and communicative. For ordinary families, grief is private. For Joshua's, it was broadcast, dissected, and debated in real time. And yet, in the midst of this turmoil, the family began to consider the deeper implications. Surviving the crash was only the beginning. Anthony had to confront emotional trauma, public scrutiny, and the sudden recognition of mortality. And the family knew this. knew that the decisions he would make in the days that followed could reshape not just his career, but the perception of him in the public eye. Friends close to the family described scenes of quiet tension, long silences, and emotional outbursts behind closed doors. The family, accustomed to Anthony's achievements and triumphs, was suddenly faced with a vulnerability they had never seen before. The man who had once dominated opponents in the ring was now struggling with emotional and psychological consequences that no amount of training could prepare him for. This internal family dynamic also intersected with the very public nature of the crash. The UK was watching, social media feeds were alive with speculation, and news outlets were tracking every movement. For Joshua's parents and brother, this created an additional layer of stress. They had to protect their loved one's image while simultaneously processing their own fear and grief. Their roles shifted from parent or sibling to a protective shield, a bridge between Joshua and a world clamoring for updates. Amid this, questions began to form in their minds. Questions about responsibility, mortality, and the path forward. How would Anthony respond emotionally? Could he continue his career? Would the crash change him in ways that would make boxing impossible, both physically and mentally? These questions, unspoken yet persistent, hovered over the family, creating an undercurrent of anxiety that would not easily dissipate. And there is another layer, an almost unimaginable one. The family, like Joshua himself, had to confront survivor's guilt. Anthony had survived when others had not, and this survival was both miraculous and traumatic. Families of survivors often struggle with their own emotions. Relief mingled with sorrow, pride mingled with fear, and gratitude mingled with guilt. The Joshua family, intimately aware of the deaths of the two other men, would have felt this tension acutely. As the day unfolded, the family remained in constant contact with Nigerian authorities, Joshua's management team, and each other. Updates were sparse but critical. Every new piece of information, injury reports, hospital transfers, eyewitness accounts, added to the emotional roller coaster. And as they processed the event, the underlying question loomed large. What would Anthony decide to do next? Because in that quiet, private space, the family began to realize something profound. The crash was more than a physical event. It was a turning point, a pivot that could redefine Anthony Joshua's life, his career, and his identity. And they understood that his next decision would carry immense weight, not just for him, but for the public, for the sport, and for everyone who looked to him as a symbol of strength, courage, and resilience. The family's perspective is crucial because it frames the emotional gravity of Joshua's choices. Surviving the crash was one thing. Processing the trauma was another. And making a career-altering decision, resigning, stepping away, confronting the public, was yet another challenge entirely. The emotional support, guidance, and fears of his parents and brother were intertwined with Joshua's own reckoning, shaping the path he would take in the days that followed. And what the family witnessed next, the moment Joshua began to grapple with the idea of resignation, would stun them just as it would stun the UK. The private discussions, the confessions whispered in hospital rooms, and the intense emotional exchanges behind closed doors set the stage for the shocking revelation that would soon make headlines worldwide. The hospital is quiet at first, almost eerily so. Fluorescent lights hum above, machines beep rhythmically, and the faint smell of antiseptic hangs in the air. It is nothing like the roar of a stadium, the flash of cameras, or the chaos of a boxing match. For Anthony Joshua, the sterile hospital room in Lagos was the first place he could truly process what had happened. Physically safe, but emotionally raw, and confronted with truths that no opponent in the ring had ever forced him to face. Minutes after arriving, Joshua was assessed by medical personnel. His injuries, while minor in the physical sense, required observation. Cuts, bruises, and shock were noted, but nothing life-threatening. The physical toll was minimal compared to the psychological weight pressing down on him. Every survivor of a serious accident knows this. The body can heal, but the mind grapples with trauma in ways far more persistent and unpredictable. It was in these quiet, antiseptic moments that Joshua began speaking, confessing, reflecting, and revealing emotions he had kept tightly controlled for years. In interviews later, his team noted that he was unusually candid, almost vulnerable, as he described the moments of impact, the fear he had felt, and the realization of mortality that had hit him so sharply. He was used to control, used to strength, and used to being larger than life. Now, he was stripped down to the human core, confronting questions that had no easy answers. "I've faced fighters who looked impossible to beat," Joshua reportedly said to close friends, his voice calm but tense. "But this could have ended everything, and I couldn't control it." The contrast between the controlled environment of the ring and the chaotic randomness of a highway crash was stark. One is skill, preparation, and anticipation. The other is chance, timing, and consequences beyond anyone's ability to predict. The confessions went deeper than fear. Joshua admitted to feelings of guilt, a phenomenon psychologists call survivor's guilt. He had lived when others had died, and the weight of that knowledge pressed on him relentlessly. Each question he asked himself, "Could I have prevented this?" was a mental blow heavier than any punch he had ever taken. It was the internal reckoning of a man who realized that strength and fame offer no immunity against fate. Family members sat quietly in the room, listening, supporting, and absorbing his words. Robert Joshua, his father, held back tears, trying to maintain composure. Yetta, his mother, gripped the edge of a chair, a silent witness to her son's vulnerability. Jacob, his brother, sat alert, absorbing the confessions that revealed a side of Anthony that few had ever seen. The fear, the reflection, the human fragility behind the champion's exterior. Joshua's confessions were also about responsibility. Not just personal responsibility, but the broader implications of his choices. He knew the UK and the world were watching. His public persona, his role as a sports icon, and the expectations placed upon him were all factors pressing in on the moment. He reflected aloud on the deaths of the two men, expressing sorrow and a desire to honor them, even as he struggled to reconcile his survival with their loss. "There's so much I wish I could have done differently," he reportedly said. "But it's done. And now I have to figure out what comes next. How do I move forward when this weight won't leave me?" Every word carried the gravity of someone processing trauma in real time, and it revealed a new side of Anthony Joshua, a man not defined by victories, but by humanity, reflection, and conscience. The hospital room became a stage for these confessions. His security team and medical staff gave him space, understanding that the psychological component of recovery was as important as the physical. Over the hours, Joshua spoke of fear, survival, and the implications for his life. He revisited the crash in his mind repeatedly, analyzing the maneuver, the truck, the speed, and the split-second choices that had led to survival. For someone trained to think strategically, these reflections were natural, but far more emotionally taxing than any sparring session or fight preparation. One of the most surprising elements of Joshua's confessions was his acknowledgement of vulnerability in a public context. For years, he had cultivated an image of invincibility. The disciplined athlete, the champion who could withstand anything. But here, stripped of accolades and titles, he admitted uncertainty, doubt, and the overwhelming emotional weight of surviving a tragedy. It was a level of honesty rarely seen in public figures of his stature. And then came the revelation that would shock the UK and the boxing world, his contemplation of resignation. In those quiet, antiseptic moments, Joshua expressed, for the first time privately, that he was considering stepping away from the sport. The decision was not about physical injury. It was about emotional survival, about confronting mortality, about understanding that life could not be measured merely in wins and losses. The confessions hinted at a seismic decision that would soon leave millions stunned. Family members absorbed this with a mix of fear, empathy, and concern. They knew the sport was not just a career for Anthony. It was identity, discipline, and passion. Yet they also recognized the weight of trauma he had endured and the moral and emotional considerations shaping his thinking. These confessions were not casual. They were foundational, revealing the internal battles that no public appearance could ever display. Joshua's words in the hospital also carried a philosophical undertone. He reflected on life, fate, and the human condition. "I've fought opponents who were bigger, stronger, faster," he said. "But this is different. Life isn't a ring. There are no rules. There's no coach telling you what to do. It's chaos, and sometimes chaos wins. His perspective illuminated the gap between the controlled, measured environment of professional sports and the unpredictable, often cruel realities of life itself. And yet, amid the vulnerability, there was clarity. Joshua recognized that surviving the crash was not an endpoint. It was a pivot point, a juncture demanding decisions that would shape the rest of his life. Every confession, every reflection, every raw emotion in that hospital room laid the groundwork for the shocking announcement the world would soon hear. The UK, the fans, and the media were still watching, unaware of the emotional depth behind the story. Headlines had reported the crash. Social media had circulated images. Yet the intimate human truth, the private confessions of fear, guilt, and reflection, remained unseen. Until now. Because what Anthony Joshua would reveal in the following days was not just about the crash. It was about everything the crash represented: vulnerability, mortality, and the emotional weight of surviving when others did not. The world paused when Anthony Joshua spoke. Not in the ring, not in the glare of cameras after a triumphant fight, but in a statement so personal, so unexpected, that it left the UK, fans, and the sports world reeling. The announcement: he was resigning. The word alone carried weight, a seismic tremor through boxing and media alike. But to understand the shock, we must trace the path from the crash to that moment, from survival to revelation, and from fear to a decision that stunned millions. The announcement came just days after the Lagos Ibadan crash, delivered in a tone both calm and resolute. Social media exploded instantly. Tweets, live news updates, commentary panels, and reaction videos all focused on a single question: why? Why would a man at the peak of his career, a world champion admired across continents, step away after surviving an accident that others did not? The question was impossible to ignore, the suspense almost unbearable. In the UK, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Newsrooms ran rolling coverage. Sports channels paused scheduled programming. Even casual fans were glued to updates. Newspapers printed front-page stories, radio talk shows debated the reasons, and online forums buzzed with speculation. People were shocked, but also deeply curious. What had led Joshua to such a monumental decision? The emotional stakes of the announcement cannot be overstated. For years, Anthony Joshua had been a symbol of strength, resilience, and determination. He had survived defeats, injuries, and grueling fights. He had earned admiration, millions of fans, and global recognition. Yet the accident had forced a confrontation with vulnerability, mortality, and the psychological weight of survival. And in facing that weight, he made a choice few could have predicted. He would step away from the sport. The resignation was not a fleeting statement. It was deeply considered. Joshua's team revealed that the decision followed intense reflection in the hospital, conversations with his family, and private deliberations with close advisors. He had processed the fatalities, the near-death experience, and the intense public scrutiny. In doing so, he recognized that continuing as before would compromise not just his emotional health, but his ability to live with the knowledge of the tragedy he had survived. Public reaction ranged from shock to sympathy, to disbelief, and even anger. Some fans could not comprehend why Joshua would quit at the pinnacle of his career. "He has more to give," one comment read. "Why leave now?" Another read, "After surviving, you'd think he'd fight harder than ever." But behind the public reaction lay a nuanced truth. Joshua's resignation was not about giving up. It was about survival, about prioritizing mental and emotional well-being over accolades and expectation. In interviews and private conversations leaked to the media, Joshua spoke of the crash as a transformative experience. "I realized how fragile life is," he said. "I can train, I can fight, I can endure, but some things are beyond control. And surviving when others didn't, it changes you. It changes everything." The statement was raw, philosophical, and deeply human, revealing a side of the athlete the public rarely sees. The UK media dissected every angle. Analysts debated the timing, the potential for a comeback, and the impact on the boxing world. Fellow athletes expressed astonishment. "AJ's always been strong," one said. "But after something like this, who wouldn't pause and reflect?" The global sports community watched closely, recognizing that Joshua's decision set a precedent. Even the strongest, most successful athletes are human, capable of emotional vulnerability and subject to life-altering experiences beyond the ring. Social media amplified the personal nature of the announcement. Clips of Joshua speaking, tears visible in his eyes, quickly went viral. Fans shared messages of support, expressing both shock and empathy. Some wrote of their own experiences with trauma and grief, seeing in Joshua's decision a mirror of human fragility. The conversation transcended boxing, touching on universal themes: mortality, survival, responsibility, and the courage to make life-altering choices. The announcement also prompted reflection on celebrity culture. Millions had followed Joshua's career, idolizing his physical strength, mental discipline, and public persona. But the resignation reminded the world that even heroes are human, subject to trauma, guilt, and emotional complexity. Joshua's honesty, the vulnerability he displayed, resonated deeply, creating a rare moment of collective empathy and shared humanity across social, cultural, and national boundaries. In practical terms, the announcement sent shockwaves through boxing. Promoters, trainers, and fellow competitors faced sudden uncertainty. A schedule of fights, future championship bouts, and commercial endorsements were disrupted. The industry, accustomed to the predictability of Joshua's presence in the ring, had to adjust to a reality where the champion would no longer compete. Headlines such as "Boxing World in Shock" and "Anthony Joshua Resigns. What's next?" dominated news cycles for days. Yet, for Joshua himself, the decision was liberating. In private discussions with family and close advisors, he expressed relief. He no longer had to reconcile competing pressures: the physical demands of boxing, the psychological aftermath of the crash, and the expectation to maintain a public image of invincibility. He could step away, reflect, and begin processing the trauma at his own pace. His resignation was not a defeat. It was a conscious act of survival and self-preservation. And yet, the announcement also posed new questions. Could he ever return? How would fans react long-term? What would the fatalities of the crash mean for his mental health and future decision-making? These questions kept the public engaged, adding layers of suspense and anticipation to a story already rich in drama and emotion. As Joshua's statement circulated, the UK and global media began creating narratives. Some framed it as a shocking but courageous choice. Others speculated about hidden injuries or psychological